Hello, everybody. Thank you for queuing up and for joining us. Today we'll be celebrating the brilliant Blue by the wonderful Karen Stevens, um, who is going to do a couple of readings from the book, and she's going to be in conversation with Maggie Hamand, who is a writer and publisher and who worked closely with Karen on editing the book, and with Barbican's own publisher, writer, and the founder of Barbican Press, Martin Goodman. And I'll hand over now to Karen, who's going to actually start with a reading for us.
Yeah, okay then. So, yes, I thought I'd start reading the opening few pages from the first story, Among the Crows. And basically, I thought I'd read that because I put it at the start of the collection because I feel that it kind of sets up the estate, which is a sort of cohesive glue throughout the stories. And it kind of sets up the atmosphere for the collection as a whole. So, so the opening Among the Crows. It was knocking on 4 o'clock when Andy decided he'd had enough. There was no end to it. Road after road of council houses with verges that he needed to trim. He'd taken his time again, just couldn't be bothered. A full hour for lunch and several tea breaks while Massiege, or Mac, they'd nicknamed him at work, kept on going. The man was a machine, intensely efficient. The heat was doing Andy in. His throat felt scorched. He switched off the strimmer, removed his goggles and ear defenders. The sudden stillness alarmed him. He glanced behind, half expecting a drugged-up maniac to lunge and nick his strimmer. Mac was on the opposite side of the road, further on, heading for the finish line. For health and safety, the council's rules were that workers must stay in pairs, but it was impossible for Andy to keep up with Mac, and impossible for Mac to slow down. Andy watched Mac's automated motion. His biceps were loaves. He swung his arms from left to right, chopping swathes of nettles and grass, getting the job done. No work, no cake, he'd say simply, whenever Andy griped about being sent into the dark heart of the Duncock estate. He sat on the verge and took in the council houses, their concrete walls bleached dirty white from the sun. Objects poked out from the parched grass of a ramshackle garden opposite. A rusting fridge revealed its mouldy interior. A child the same age as his Cora could fit in there, closing the door to hide, suffocating within minutes. He kept his eye on the fridge and felt relieved that he lived on the outskirts of this sprawling estate where things were less desperate and hostile. They'd been here all week, and this was their last day. His mind felt increasingly light as the day progressed, as if he'd come through something. Worse than Syria, he told his girls last night. His eldest, Emma, gave him a haughty look, not a clue what he was on about. It used to be simple with Emma. She was his girl. Nowadays, she made him feel useless, like he'd been dredged from a prehistoric bog. We have a saying, Max said yesterday when Andy relayed some of Emma's backchat. Kids and fish don't have a voice. He liked that. He liked all Mac's Polish sayings, how his voice grew soft with nostalgia. Anything could happen here. He sensed it in the stillness, the lack of trees and plants, the biting looks of passers-by, their skins the same bleached colour as their houses. If he was jumped for the strimmer, they could have it. He wouldn't risk having his face slashed like that poor lad at work he'd been told about. Gina thought Andy was the spit of John Travolta when they'd first met. His dimpled chin had reeled the girls in, but he settled on Gina because she was mad for him, insatiable. Then things took a turn and darkened after the girls were born, and everything became tainted, rotten. Christ, it was hot. Andy took off his t-shirt and marvelled at the dark patches that ran in long V's down the front and back. He pulled a bottle of water from his rucksack and drank and lay back. The grass was like hay and made his back itch, but he liked the uncomfortable feeling. He raised his head to view his torso, still ridged and muscular. He dropped his head back and recalled Gina's anger when he'd pushed her hands off him this morning. There was no desire in him now, no fury, that thing that she was always after. She didn't get that he was broken, that she and Samantha had finally broken him. "You all right, Andy?" Mac asked. Andy opened his eyes. The sun's white glare was behind Mac's square silhouette. "Problem with the strimmer," he lied. "You want me to finish your side? You sure?" Andy sat and took up the strimmer as if he was planning on fixing it. "No problem," Max said. "We okay for Tesco?" "Gina's given me a list." This was Andy's second lie to Mac, but he didn't want to go home to hear Gina's tense analysis of what was lacking in him. So that's the opening few pages.
Thank you.
That's lovely, Karen. Thank you very much for reading. And Dancock Estate really is like a character. They often say that, don't they, about a place being like a character in fiction. It's certainly true in your collection. I wondered about the inspiration for these stories. I mean, is this where you grew up or where you've lived? How do you know this world so well?
It's I well, my sister lives on the estate, so I sort of have, have a very and has done for like 40 odd years. So I know the estate really well. So the I and it does have a real presence. It's, I go there and I kind of experience the sort of alien sense of it. I mean, one time I went to my sister's, and on the verge opposite was a fridge, and that was the first time that I felt really quite I felt the lawlessness of the place in a sense, but it's not like that either. It's really nice. Everybody knows each other, obviously. There's good community there. But I suppose in the collection, I wanted a particular atmosphere. So it's very loosely based on the estate. And I think the atmosphere is something that I've kind of conjured in a sense from that. And the opening, I suppose it's kind of skewed by Andy's perspective, who's the central character, because he doesn't see himself quite as part of that estate. He lives on the outskirts, but he's not in the center. So he kind of has those judgments on people who live in the center of it being lawless, of it being kind of like the dark heart. And so I guess that opening thing is skewed from Andy's perspective as well. But I did want it to sort of conjure an atmosphere throughout. I'm not quite sure what that atmosphere is in a sense.
Well, you certainly succeeded. I think it does have a very strong atmosphere, and I really could visualize it in my mind as well as I was reading the stories. And your stories are also, they're very tense, which gives them a great narrative drive. And you have this feeling that you're on the edge all the time of violence breaking out. You sort of half expect that something awful is about to happen. And I just thought that worked so well as a kind of device because it really keeps you hooked and deeply embedded in the stories. Um, I wondered whether that was a conscious thing that you had set out to achieve.
Um, I mean, personally, I think that short stories, are about conflict, and that I don't think that has to be. I mean, fiction is as well, but I think short stories are about a sort of conflict, and that doesn't have to be dramatic conflict where a fight breaks out necessarily or something, but there is something that's kind of on the cusp of occurring, and I think I think what stories are about things in motion. So if you're just having these happy, contented stories, then already the action's done and dusted, and you're dealing with something that's kind of narratively sterile, so to speak. So I guess all of the stories are on the cusp of something happening, which is a part of the short story form in a way, because as David Lodge, the kind of playwright, says, you get in late and you get out early. So you're sort of, what you're getting is that kind of middle sense of something being utterly in motion. Um, uh,
Yeah, I think Raymond Carver said something very similar as
mm,
well. Um, yeah, I think my favourite story in the collection was Out of Kilter. I found it almost unbearable how the main character can't see what she's doing wrong, and and also outraged because in a way she isn't doing anything wrong. She's doing her best, and it just comes across wrong. And you can sort of see both perspectives in that story. And it really brought to mind the sort of tragedy of communication difficulties and how hard it is to really open up and talk to one another. And that again is something that runs through all the stories, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it was intentional necessarily, but it is something that runs through all the stories. You have these very kind of intimate relationships, and there's, a deep lack of communication that goes on. And I don't know if that's kind of a working class thing, having been brought up in a working class household myself. Things weren't ever talked about. Um, so, maybe there's a part of that that's kind of fed into the stories in some way. Um,
And why do you think that is that things aren't talked about?
that's a
I
really
recognize that.
um, that's a really good question. I think the thing is, it sounds a bit cliched as well, doesn't it? To say, working class people, you tend to pull your bootstraps up and get on with it. You don't tend to confront a lot of things that are really kind of upsetting to you, or express how you're feeling, whether that's love or whatever. So I think that's a really sweeping statement, but I think I think I think in my stories there is just this kind of lack of being able to talk to each other in that very real way, and that's what kind of isolates people at the same time as not enabling. They're not able to kind of move forward in many cases. Um,
I'm
and
not
there's
sure.
one story, Blissful Blue, with a student character who kind of funnels everything into just talking, political ranting and going on about politics and, the position of the socialists and all this, that, and the other. And in some ways, he's not really talking about something that's quite fundamental, which is um, about not fitting in, about not having a kind of father figure in the picture at all, about having a mother that he's very close to, but a lot of their kind of closeness then arises in jokes and things like that. So again,
I'm sure there are a lot of middle class families and others who have these
yeah,
communication
definitely,
difficulties as well. And it's often something that gets passed on through families, isn't it?
yeah,
That because the parents don't talk to the children when the children have their own children, they can't communicate well with them. But also just this uh, thing about not being able to all the family rivalries and stresses, and you bring those out so well, I think, in all the stories, in the relationships between the characters, and it's very real and it's very moving at times, even though you keep feeling, do something different, say something, but the characters can't. I
yeah,
thought I thought that was very effective. And of course, if you keep the lid on things in fiction, it creates this sort of bubbling kind of thing underneath where you feel the tension, you feel the stress, and you kind of want to know what's going to happen.
and I think in real life we often can't say those really important things to each other, and there are these tensions that go on for years, forever sometimes, and they're never properly spoken about. So in some ways, um, rather than it being a kind of a literary thing where I'm trying to sort of create a tension, I think it's just about those ordinary tensions that we have, as we're kind of just trying to get by. And like you say, I think that is the same in middle class families and working class families. But And I do have, one of the stories, has a more kind of middle class setting, in a suburban house just outside of the Duncock estate. But again, with both of the couples in that who start drinking really heavily and they don't actually know each other, as things kind of bubble up, you realise that the very kind of middle class couple, there's a deep rooted problem with them in that they don't have children and that it's not kind of on the table for discussion. And then, of course, with the main protagonist, um, she's not particularly happy in her situation with, she's kind of blown up her whole life to a certain extent, which she was unhappy with in her previous marriage, but now actually she's not happy in this marriage either. So, how do you sort of confront that in a sense? Because you've got to confront the fact that you've made a mistake as well, haven't you?
Yes, yes, very much so. Yeah. So again, that is about what isn't said.
Yeah,
And I thought your dialogue was brilliant in the sense of all the stuff that's not said, because I think dialogue is all about what isn't said. If characters just say what they mean, there's no story there, because it's all about what we conceal from one another, what we don't say, the lies that we say to ourselves, the lies that we tell others. And I think again that's something that came over really well in
yeah.
your story.
Um, I think one thing that I am really interested in as a writer, and I think all writers are as well, obviously, but I'm I'm deeply interested in how people live their emotional lives, their inner lives, um, which can be very different to our outer lives. How we sort of present ourselves to other people, how we engage with other people is completely what we're doing, what we say outwardly is just so completely different to our interior lives, where they're deeply private. And I suppose that's one thing that I was particularly one thing I was very aware that I was doing in the stories is trying to access those kind of hidden emotional lives of the characters. And these characters are living in kind of emotional lives inside systems that are deeply unequal. So I think that was something that I was very consciously trying to do.
If I
Yeah.
could just jump in, I'll come back to you, Maggie, for a moment. Just jump in quickly on that point, because it's one thing I'd been noting. The story you just read from Among the Crows, Andy says about Matt, the Polish guy who is walking away. They've seen each other's fear and humiliation, and this tiny piece of knowledge was a dust mote that would always hang between them. And one of the things that really struck me in all the stories in Brilliant Blue is how you use the art of the story to show us how articulate these people are, in fact, about their emotions and their situations. And like we have Andy's perspective on that story. You talk about it being skewed, but then we get Gina's, his wife, and then we get Emma, his daughter, closing the story. And we actually see that they are all seeing what the other characters are and the situations they're in. They can't communicate it to each other, but you, through the story, are giving us that full breadth of their understanding of the mess they're in, and so they can't articulate it, but you're doing it for them, really, in the story. You're giving that breadth to these characters.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the wonderful thing about kind of close third person, isn't it? Where you can kind of have the you're not right inside that person. You've got that camera sort of slightly on the shoulder, so therefore, you can kind of add the things that couldn't necessarily be articulated by the characters themselves. But nevertheless, even though they can't articulate it, it's something that they are kind of perhaps semi-consciously understanding. Even, it's like a sort of suppressed epiphany, isn't it? It's kind of something that's there, but that it's not being fully articulated by them.
Mm,
Um,
mm. I wanted to ask you about the connections between the stories because a lot of the characters appear in other stories, and they're all connected to one another. And I just wondered, when you were writing the stories, did that come up organically, or was it something that you had to add in later, or was it a mixture of the two?
Um, it was a mixture of the two, actually. So when I started writing the collection, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of a collection. I was thinking about it as just as, individual short stories that I was writing and I was crafting with an idea for sending them out to competitions or whatever. Um, but then, at some point I sat down and thought, oh, I've got quite a good few short stories here, and I started looking at them. And I guess in that sense, it was a really interesting process for me as a writer, because it was almost like I was kind of forming a writerly identity in a sense, because I began to see the themes that interested me. So I was sort of letting the work speak to me rather than me imposing an agenda on it. So I began to see the kind of the themes that were running through, which were about class for sure, and they were about kind of miscommunications and those kind of things. But I I forgot your question. What did you?
It
What was?
was about whether you had the connections between the stories had arisen organically, or whether
Yeah,
you'd consciously
yeah.
put them in.
So then I began to see which ones kind of had some sort of, were the strongest and had a kind of through line with, running through them. And then I thought, right, okay, I probably need to, and I think I definitely worked on the setting as a kind of cohesive glue for all the stories. That was my next thing. But then I really love short stories where characters, play bit parts and move in and out of stories, and where you read one kind of story from the angle of one character, and then you read it from the other person. So with Among the Crows and Vast and Deep, you've got a husband and a wife, and they're in the same situation. And in the first story, you'd think that um, uh, Gina actually comes across as being, quite awful in a sense from Andy's point of view. But then in her story, you get her viewpoint, where she's actually in a really difficult situation, living in a kind of dead marriage with somebody who's um, headed into full depression. So you get those. So there's kind of no moral judgments when you have these different angles, and I love that in short story collections. And so I began to forge more connections between the stories. So there was a definite kind of intentional development in the stories, where, even in some, I brought a character in who wasn't originally in that story. I also kind of had two short stories with two sisters, and I wrote one, and then I thought I'd really like to write the other sister's viewpoint. So it's been a really long process. Yeah. And then Brilliant Blissful Blue, the last story that's really long, I I just really enjoyed him when he walks into Vast and Deep, one of the stories, and he just walks into the pub and has a moan about posh people and how they just take everything for themselves. And I kind of couldn't let him go in a sense. So I sort of thought that the collection was done, but then he was a character that I was really interested in. And then that took another 2 years to write, which was really
Hmm.
frustrating. But I think it was the right thing. I think that story should have been there for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and the collection is partly named after that. Um, we're going to hear a bit of the story Brilliant Blue in a moment, but I just wanted to ask one more question, because we had quite a job, didn't we, choosing the running order for the stories, and we changed it, in fact. Could you talk just a little bit about that? Because I think it does work better as it is. Um,
Yeah. Well, I thought when I was putting it all together, those stories, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be quite good if they're kind of out of time, if they're not in chronological order, because then the reader may be reading, for instance, with the two sisters, their stories, they could read one that actually comes later, and then they'll read the one, it's from an earlier point in time, and then they'll sort of, the reader will fill those gaps in between. So I thought, isn't this a brilliant idea? And then of course I sent to you, you just said, no, this is not working at all. I can't, keep my eye on who's who and what's what. It was just a bit of a kind of tumbling mess in a sense. So I thought, yeah, you've got a good point. So then I had to go back and look at the stories in terms of, a more chronological order, so that the reader could keep characters in their head, because it's moving forward. So I did that, and I think that was a really good decision I think it was a really good thing that you pointed out to me. And then it was funny because once I'd done that, and then I sort of had a time away and then read it, it almost had this, almost like a flow of a novel, even though it's not quite a novel, because you're sort of moving forward with developments and with characters and things. So I definitely feel that was the right decision. But then, apart from that, there are all those other things that you have to think about in putting a collection together, like really practical things, like what are the conversations that are going on between the stories? Are the openings different enough? Are the ending lines speaking to the next story or not? Are they kind of in argument with each other? Viewpoints, do you don't want to have all your first person stories together, and your third, you need to have that kind of variety in story length and in terms of viewpoints, male, female. So there are all these different considerations while trying to put them in chronological order as well. So yeah, it's an interesting process, and I'm very glad that you just said to me, oh no.
Well, it's a fascinating process, and it was a great pleasure to edit your stories. They did not need an awful lot of editing, but I'm glad that I was able to make some helpful comments and maybe get the stories in the right order. I think now it would be nice to hear from your second story that you've chosen to read, and then we'll hand over to Martin, who I know has some more questions for you.
So I thought I'd read the opening few pages to Blissful Blue, which is the story that I spent about 2 years trying to get together, and it's 9,000 words, so it's quite a surprise because I thought it was going to be about 5,000, but it's about 9,000. So it's a long short story, and the story is about a kind of a sort of radical politics student who lives on the estate and decides he's going to kind of escape, and he's going to do something that he's really passionate about, which is politics and trying to sort of change things for the better. And so these are the first few pages. So in his break, he has to go and work in this DIY store, and it's called Duncock DIY, and it's on the estate. And so he's working there with a group of people who have very different political opinions to him. So I've kind of pitted him against the others in this kind of, and it's boiling hot in this heated space, so that there can be a bit of chaos and mayhem that comes about. So the first few pages, and also it's at the time of lockdown, which makes everything even more claustrophobic. So it's boiling hot, it's in lockdown, and he's having to work on trolley duty outside of Duncock DIY. So you need nerves of steel to work on trolley duty, the leather skin of a rhino. On the notice board in the substandard staff room, we rate insults fired at us from the public. Bellend, twat, knob, wanker, flange-phobic. Dickhead. Flange-phobic has taken the #1 slot for a week now. When it comes to insults in this place, the genitals win. Duncock DIY reopened for weeks after 3 months of lockdown, and every afternoon I'm shoved on trolley duty. Today it's blazing, the air thick and syrupy. Melting tarmac throws up glints of hard light. To lift the queue's mood, I deliver the store's safety spiel in the staccato gibberish of Boris Johnson. Each time I distribute a trolley, I end with, as we all know, this virus is the biggest stitch-up since the Bayeux Tapestry. That gets a laugh. When I get back from uni, Mum insisted I perform her favourite impersonations, Simon Cowell, Eric Morecambe, Gordon Brown, while she sat on the sofa with a white wine, fag in hand. Why are you wasting your talents studying politics, Bez? People like us don't stand a chance, she said, bemused, fag drooping. It's a burden, her loneliness. John the manager saunters up and rubs his latex-gloved hands together. His biceps bulge like the Hulk's. That's right, he says covertly through his mask. Keep him laughing so they don't get fed up and piss off to B&Q. John's dodgy cultural references and dubious politics place him in his late 50s, I reckon. He looks after himself, though. He works out every day at the gym and has an abundant crop of blonde hair, dyed for sure, that has a greenish kryptonite tinge when passing under fluorescent lighting. We haven't been this busy in years, John says with relish. On our knees we were. This morning I detoured past B&Q just to give it the finger, no less. Do you know why? He'd put an insomniac to sleep. Because our sales are up by 85%. He cracks his walnut-sized knuckles. No doubt about it, he says, like he's arguing a point. This pandemic's been a godsend for the DIY industry. Always a silver lining then, I say. I'm nothing, if not an optimist, he responds. Sometimes I wonder if he's somewhere on the spectrum. He never picks up on sarcasm. Excuse me, a woman with a bagel-like bun shouts from the front of the queue. Someone's come out, which means I can go in. Certainly, madam. John gestures towards the sanitised trolleys with a bow. Don't forget the staff meeting after work, Bez. He gives me a meaningful look from under his tailored, surely, eyebrows. And when you head back to university, ask if they can teach you how to lighten up, eh? University. Just 5 more weeks before I'm heading up north to sit in the white lecture rooms with their blue seats and tiny flip-down writing tablets, rubbing shoulders with like-minded people, so the marketing goes. I wanted to get away from the boneheads of my estate to talk solutions to the rise of political populism and increasing inequalities, but the students I've met, digitally or face-to-face, talk endlessly about their gut, yah, and don't feel remotely self-conscious about owning expensive stuff like laptops and cars. So that was just the opening.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I love that story. You say that story came from the character coming to you, first of all. Is that the normal seed for your story as a character, or is it a place or a situation or an incident?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's about something I've seen or something I've heard or something I've experienced. Or I'm sort of a very imagistic person, so if an image comes to me, if it stays, then I know that it's going to work into a story. So I just had a really strong image of Bez in the first story, where he just has a walk-on part where he's kind of dripping wet in the doorway, and all he wants is a box of matches because he wants to light a fag, and they won't give him the matches, and he's just kind of seething with what he thinks are the posh people, keeping everything for themselves and fuck us lot kind of thing. So that definitely grew from that, and then the place became really important to me. I mean, I started off that story, which is probably why it took so long, because I decided that, I don't know, I got really obsessed with the idea of the Porsche, which is the ultimate kind of yuppie symbol of the 80s. And I did masses of research around Porsches, just masses. And in my workshop group, which Dave Swan was part of, and Beth Ann, who are here, thank you for coming. It was just awful, really. It just wasn't working. And then it wasn't until I sort of stepped back and thought about that character, and I gave him something that I feel, which is what I call it a kind of state of in-betweenness, where, I've been very lucky to have a foot in two camps, one in, the working class, because I grew up in a working class household, and one in the kind of middle class household, because I went and did a degree in my 20s, I got educated, and then I managed to kind of work in academia. So but I've always felt that kind of state of in-betweenness of feeling very uncomfortable in very predominantly middle class kind of environments, but also don't fit particularly in my working class roots any longer. So I sort of gave that to Bez in a sense, and he sort of experiences that in his story. And that's when he kind of came alive, and that's what enabled me to kind of bring in the other layers of meaning into the story, really. Once I'd decided that, but it took a long time. A lot of Porsche stuff. And in the end, the comment on the Porsche is about one line, which is that from Bez's point of view, it looks like a tea tray on the back. And it's tomato red, like those dispensers, those old-fashioned dispensers you get in takeaways or whatever, tomato things that you squeeze. And that was about it. But in a sense, just that one line completely encapsulates how Bez feels about the kind of, the Porsche and everything that it kind of represents to him as a kind of socialist. The great socialist sort of activist.
I wondered about the question of when something's going to be a short story, when something's going to be a novel, and this has elements of both. And the element of short stories was really there for me is the sheer intensity and compression of a story. And one of the things I realize maybe about the Dunkirk estate that you're writing about is that there's no way out. And Bez really is one of the few characters there that has a way out. And Emma at the end is trying to find one in books, but hasn't quite. She's shown to a motel, but it is not quite as safe as she'd like. And she goes off into her imagination. Bez says to a couple of girls in the story, "Hey, you're really bright. Why don't you go to university? You should." And they say, "Look, we can't all do like you. We can't all go to university and do politics." No, they recognize they're stuck where they are. And I wonder if that's part of why these are short stories, because a novel is this long narrative with characters looking for and finding a way out. Maybe this became the longest story because the character is finding a way out. It actually, the ending with him and his mom has a kind of almost like a happy resolution to it all as well. Coming through the mist to some sort of conclusion.
I mean, that's really interesting reading, because I feel really sad about the ending. I feel like he kind of strikes out. He goes to university, and part of his whole experience of working at Dunkirk DIY sort of makes him realize that he doesn't fit in with the university lot, with with that area. He just doesn't fit in because he's not middle class, and that may be his internalization of kind of class hierarchies rather than how it actually was at university for him. But then he also doesn't fit in on the estate anymore, obviously, because his friends just think he's a bit of a wanker now, so he can't be with his friends. And the only place he realizes he can be at the end of the morning is at the end of the story is kind of at home with his mum. So there's a kind of, there is I think there is a sort of happy element to that because they're very close. But I also felt really sad because I'd always intended for him to kind of walk off into the distance, and he never does. He is just kind of still there. So,
yeah, I guess so. But that was lockdown. But he lightened up his mother and redecorating the place and all of that.
I do sort of think that although that's the end of the story, I do kind of feel that he would strike out in the future. I don't think that that's it for him at all, but it did surprise me, the ending, because I'd never intended for that to happen at all.
And you've given him the first person, of course, as well, so he's able to actually articulate, where in the other stories you as the writer are giving them giving voice to their emotions. There
Yeah.
he's not. I'm interested as well in your choices of language. Here's a little bit. This is a pretty tough story about life and death. There's this woman giving her. It's called the vigil, and this woman's sort of getting a sort of a fairly unstable neighbor looking after her little toddler, and while then she finds this collapsed man on a street. Here's a line about the man. The old man's eyeballs had sunk behind the ridge of his sockets, reminding Sarah of her mom's Yorkshire pudding tin with its neat circular dips. I love that. And I love that her term of reference was a Yorkshire pudding tin. And so I wondered, did you work to get the right terms of reference? And or did they just come because you were so much inside the person's persona and life experience that the references would be the references that came?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think that reference that you're talking about. I think that was quite purposeful, because the whole story is about the loss, the death of her mother, really, and the very reason why she stands next to this dead body of this old man in the snow. It's really, really heavy snow, and she's the one who's gone out to get milk, because she's a single mum, so she's just got to go out and get milk for her toddler, and so she comes across the body, and I sort of. But the whole reason that she does the vigil and she stays with the body is really because on a deeper level, it's about her mother, and her mother becoming very ill, and her father kind of, in a sense, having a lack of kind of respect or dignity for the mother, and also for her kind of needs at that time. And so she kind of stays there because she's sort of trying to put right something that wasn't right earlier, and give him a bit of dignity. But I wanted the mother to kind of be there, in just little kind of glimpses throughout the story. So that was one kind of quite intentional thing that I'd done, that where she's linking it back to the mother, and then gradually, we kind of have that revelation as to what the deeper kind of motivation is for her as a character. Yeah.
A final question from me before we move on to see what questions might be there from the team. So if you're thinking of a question of your own, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question direct to Karen, or pop it into chat, and Mike's the magus of the chat room there, so he'll be coming in with it. And my question there is, I think sometimes we write the book that we want to read, and did you do that? And in that case, what was the book you wanted to read that you couldn't find anywhere else, so you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're always, we always end up writing the kinds of books that we do gravitate towards. And I think that, our reading is about kind of your experiences in some way being spoken to you. And I haven't said that, I love reading stuff that's completely separate to me. But a lot of the writers that I really love write about sort of injustice or prejudice in some way, or kind of inequality and unfairness. Like I really love Livy Michael. I love the work of Ken Loach for all of this. I particularly love Elizabeth Strout, because she writes about that state of in-betweenness in her writing, and that really speaks to me. So, I guess, yes, I do gravitate towards fiction that is in the same area as me.
Do you feel that the characters that you're writing about are not represented enough in fiction? You would like there to be more, so that you're writing more, and you feel that these characters are maybe just seen and blanked out and not understood, so you want to open the windows for readers to say, look, these are real people with lives as rich and wide and dynamic and far-ranging as any other.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is that kind of cliche, isn't there, about working class writing, is that you've either got people who are just ignorant and lazy and, on benefits, or they love community and family, and so you've got those kind of cliches. But actually, I think that the people that I write about, have exactly the same hopes and aspirations as anybody else, and um, it's just about getting inside them and their stories. And the only difference is that their financial situations are more precarious, so things can sometimes be more urgent, perhaps. But I think I think there does need to be more kind of more voices out there that aren't just kind of trammeling the sort of middle class fiction path. But I I suppose I just write what I know, where I come from. I mean, the writer Joyce Carol Oates, she said something along the lines that our childhood kind of soaks into the marrow of your bones and condition your interpretation of the world afterwards. So, your perspective on the world is always coloured by where you come from, and I think that is true, and I think that's why, even though I live a very different life now, I've got middle class children, for goodness sake, who are who come up with lovely middle class things, but
I like, by the way, that you have access to that young mind. I mean, one of my favorite writers, people like, oh dear, Barbara Vine. What's her other name? Ruth, whatever. I forget her last.
Ruth Rendell.
Ruth Rendell, yeah. She wrote things really well, but her teenagers were never authentic to me. And similarly, Patrick White, he was writing teenagers of like 50 years before. Your teenagers are speaking like of now, and you had Bez there looking at somebody, viewing him as a 57-year-old from his judgments and things like that. And do you feel like working with the students is giving you that access, and the student body that you have in Chichester, and do your kids give you access to that as well, and their friends? Are you actually tuning yourself in to keep your writing current and alive and there now?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I always say to my students, when I retire in a few years, I'll probably shrivel up and die in about 6 months, because they're very energetic, and they are really funny, and I love that sort of life force that young people have. Even in lockdown, my youngest son was sort of driving to a car park, and everyone else, all the young people driving to a car park, and they were in their cars tooting their horns and kind of having a conversation through car horns and things. And I just kind of feel that young people are they're just very resourceful and energetic, and so I get angry when they're talked about differently. But so I think my students do, but also I think for myself, probably one of the most kind of intense times that I had was being a teenager, and those experiences and those feelings and everything. And again, as I was saying earlier, I tend to kind of think in images, so images stay with me, and I have so many images from that time that have worked their way into parts of a story in some way, whether that's just a feeling or an image. But I do draw on that quite a lot. So,
Good.
yeah, so I'm glad you feel that they feel real.
I love it. Yeah, and I love the whole range, all the generational range and push and all of that. Okay, make us of the chat room. Mike, over to you.
Well, thank you for the readings, Karen, and it's been great insight and great conversation so far. So just there is a message here as well, actually, from Dave, has said that Holly and Paul from the university wanted to get in, but they couldn't get onto the call, unfortunately. So someone let them. But Holly has bought the book and wanted to let you know that. So
that's nice. I'll have to email her.
lots of love and support there. And Diane's asked a question here saying, hi Karen, thank you for a super insight. Are there any characters or storylines that you feel you would want to develop further?
Well, interestingly, as Martin was saying, the Duncott DIY story, it is long, but I can feel other kind of narratives coming in. I think like I suppose I always think about a novel as being, again, thinking about it imagistically. I always think about it as being like um, a a sort of runner, a carpet runner that you roll out and it goes forward and then it comes to an end point. Whereas a short story, I imagine it to be a bit like a boiled sweet, where you have the whole thing and you have the whole flavor of it, and you can roll it around your tongue and around your mouth. Um, and I think most of them are are that. So that it is nothing more. They are the moments. Whereas the that story, Duncott DIY, I do feel like there are other. I can see a sort of a longer narrative and other things coming into it in some way. Yeah.
Doug is a real character in that one.
Yeah.
The wild man.
Oh yes, Dougie. Yeah, yeah. He's a kind of sort of he's a bit of an anarchist, isn't
Yeah.
he? He's an ex kind of raver, still a party pill popper kind of guy. Yeah, and I love him as well.
Yeah,
The thing I love
he
about
brushes
that,
and he bashes our hero on the back, knocks him out, and brushes off into the next story. You feel like there's another episode awaiting out there.
yeah, yeah, and the thing I love about this story is that I think there's quite a lot of fun in that story as well, which is good, because like in class, to the British, it's a serious subject matter, but also we're really good at kind of poking fun at it as well. I've just watched a whole series of The Good Life, and I just really enjoyed that. Partly nostalgic, but also partly it's just really funny. And keeping up appearances with Hyacinth Bouquet. I mean, just hilarious. Yeah. So I enjoyed sort of, getting a bit more fun out of that. Though I like humour. So there's a lot of humour, kind of dark humour sometimes, kind of bubbling through the stories as well.
That's good, and it does it. I mean, that story is one of my favorites as well, and it definitely stands out. And I think, as Martin pointed out, with the change of perspective and things, there's different things about that in lots of ways it stands out in different ways. But it is a fantastic read, and you do get that sort of dark humor in there, and you do get all that anarchy and everything that's in. So it's is a real achievement there. And I think actually what you were saying sort of feeds in a little bit with this next question we've got from Adam, who said, given that there's a current of class divide in the stories, and your choice to set the book in a state with an atmosphere and create that as a sense of as a character in itself, is there an overarching message or question or thought that you want people to take away from the book as a whole?
Um, Thank you, Adam. That's a good question. You were meant to ask a really simple question. um, I think, I think I think it sort of links to perhaps what Martin was saying about just having other voices out there that people engage with. So knowing that there are other people dealing with life in a way that you not, and I think that's the brilliant thing about all fiction. We read fiction because we want to step into somebody else's shoes. We want to experience the world and things that we may not, necessarily experience for ourselves. So that's what we do. Um, and so I guess I mean, the thing that encapsulates it for me is that there's at the front there's a kind of epigraph from Elizabeth Strout, if I can find it. And she said, "My hope is always that readers receive a book when they need it, that after reading it, they realize, even fleetingly, what it feels like to be another person." And, so I guess if there was a message there, then you know, I'd like people to get that from the book, to just kind of think about, other lives, other ways that people get along, really.
Well, I think you do a good job of presenting that and those different situations that people are in that way. And that probably, as you say, comes from you having sort of a foot in both worlds in a way, and to say actually kind of beneath the surface, there's a lot of similarity there. No matter
Hmm.
however kind of things might appear on the surface, below that there's that sort of humanity that links us. It's a great achievement. We've Tom's got his hand raised, so I'm gonna if we Tom wants to unmute and ask his question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm really interested from a writer's point of view, and maybe even from a publisher's point of view, what the pros and cons are of having a collection based on an estate like that. And I think what I'm trying to get at is the difference between collections with completely separate stories and collections where the stories very deliberately hang together much more closely.
Maybe is that more of a publisher question? I mean, for me, it was a case of writing a collection that reflected something that I personally really like in short stories. I love it when characters walk in and out of each other's worlds, and the effect and seeing the effects that people have on other people. But in terms of, from a publisher's perspective, what do you all feel?
I think it's really good to have that community that you're exploring, and it could be a prison, it could be an Oxford College, and here you're given us Doncott Council Estate, and I really welcome having that be the place we're looking into, because these to me are lives that are interesting, and everybody has they're almost facing a daily life or death struggle. Let's get through it. So there's such intense drama from those lives and those little pockets that are all interconnected. So I think for me, Tom, the setting gives the interconnection between the stories, and they're not random in that way. But I'm happy to have this as being rather than the middle class people going in and out of each other's beds and trying to find meaning in life, and meeting outside the children's schools and all of that stuff. And I'm pleased to have works in there as well. It's interesting to have a work situations. Most writers don't deal with work, and Brilliant Blue does.
It's funny that, isn't it? Because, work forms, 75% of our lives, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's Gina working in sort of cleaning jobs and hospital bar. I mean, just to try and make money, because Andy's sort of not being able to hold down his job, but he's trying to do it all on eBay, and it's all very real.
I'm conscious we're right at the end. We have just got another question in the chat that I just want to throw out for you, that we'll finish up with. Dave said there, I love Martin's idea about your characters being stuck, and it occurs to me that situation comedies are often about characters not being able to escape. How important is the situation itself when you write?
Thanks, Dave. That's another hard question. I think I think the situation is really crucial when I'm writing it, because it's the situation, the events that the characters are going through that kind of that lead to the kind of revelation for them. So so on the surface, they're dealing with something that's going on, but actually that leads to their inner selves in some way. So trying to think of one of, they all do it to a certain degree, but maybe in Vast and Deep, with Gina working in the pub, she's taken on another job to get herself, to get money, basically, and then at this point, this sort of strange kind of thing occurs, this kind of S&M thing starts coming back to her, a memory from childhood, and so it kind of, the situation that she's in this pub, and this sort of fizzing attraction with the owner of the pub, who's an old friend of hers from school, it all kind of cracks open into something that's deeper and has long roots and is darker. But really, what this whole sort of memory from childhood is about is the fact that she's, in the present, she's living in this kind of stultifying environment. She's in these soulless jobs, and she's in this kind of dead marriage. So it's about kind of being alive, about finding life, probably. It's about expressing those kind of frustrations, more so perhaps than the actual memory or the S&M kind of element of it being something that is what it's all about. So it's the sort of situation of working, the situation in the stories that kind of are like a window into their kind of more their private inner selves, which is what really interests me in fiction.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Karen, for being so gracious in bringing us into the workings of your mind. There's some beautiful readings, and for it's great. It really was. I know it's hard being a writer. I find myself, you do these things and you actually are feeling quite vulnerable, and I think, oh, I don't know, but it's good. And your stories are really strong. You're very clear about them. And thanks everybody else for coming in and sharing the evening. And it'll be there as Mike's going to make us of the editing as well. He's going to be editing this and putting it out as a whole, and on little YouTube clips as well, along with your questions. And it's been a wonderful festival. We've got one more of the Barbican Festival of Fiction coming. Miranda Mella, who's far from debut, but she's actually going back to her childhood, which is evoked in 1950s London, in a brilliant and honest and open novel called When I Was. And Miranda's going to be live in this slot at 6 o'clock. So please sign in for that as well. And please, let's just give a mental a round of applause for Karen. And thanks a lot. Would you like to say anything? Would you like to say your own farewell, Karen?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming along and joining and listening. It's something, you're writing your stories, but you don't expect it to become something that you're going to be talking about to an audience, So it's a lovely thing when it happens. And Sam knows that as well. So thank you very much. I'm so pleased that so many of you turned up. And thank you very much for putting on the event as well. It's been great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, all.
Thanks, everyone.